My mother used to work in a hotel in Washington, D.C. back in the 90s as a housekeeper/maid, since she needed the money because she was a refugee from Vietnam. Even though she didn't speak much English at the time, she knew enough to get by at her job, and all the other staff and hotel guests loved her because of how sweet she was. Because of this, any high-profile guests such as the Backstreet Boys would stay at the hotel. The manager always sent my mum to clean the room, since she was so good at it. Anyway, one day a guest comes called Mr. Michelson. He checked into the most expensive suite. As usual, the manager told my mum to go take care of his room. As she got there was a "Do Not Disturb" sign, so she told the manager she would come back later. What was weird was that no one was ever allowed into his room. The man stayed for almost a month, and not once did he let staff come in to clean. However, he paid a lot, and gave a warm welcome every time he passed as staff member/housekeeper, so no one paid him any mind. Then one day came when people didn't see him anymore, so they assumed he checked out. Even though the receptionist had no account of this, since it had been so long since the room was cleaned and the "Do Not Disturb" sign wasn't on the door anymore, the manager told my mum to check it out and to try and clean up what she could. As she got to the floor and unlocked the door to the room, a disturbing smell hit her. She couldn't figure it out, but she continued to survey the room, which was disgustingly messy. Her words were that it looked like someone had thrown a rave, even though no other guests seemed to have ever gone into the room besides Mr. Michelson. It had looked like he had deserted the place without telling anyone. My mum was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track it down. As she followed her nose, she could tell it was coming from the hotel room closet. When she opened the closet, there was nothing but a cardboard box on the ground, from which the smell was resonating from. In that moment, from being a housekeeper, my mother's first instinct was to open the box and see what was in there, to clean and/or throw it out. When she opened the box, what she saw scarred her to this day. It was the rotting/decomposing head of a young woman, chopped off. My mother immediately screamed and got out of there, and fainted in the elevator. Once she woke up, cops were everywhere, and the hotel was like a CSI scene. The manager told her that the resident didn't leave his real name, and had used a fake credit card to check in. The head of the woman had been identified as a local sex worker. I never learnt the nitty-gritty details, but needless to say, my mum quit that same day.
For more than 100 years now, both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts have sat around roaring log fires at night and carried on the rich tradition of telling campfire tales. For the most part, these stories have detailed the murderous exploits of all kinds of boogeymen, monsters, and cryptids. Yet some touch on another oft-told urban legend, that of the deranged psycho killer, the escaped asylum patient, hell-bent on the meaningless slaughter of innocents. However, as terrifying as these stories may be, we still use them for entertainment purely on the premise that they're completely fictional, that the monsters we're so afraid of can't really hurt us. There aren't any real psychopathic killers out there in the woods, are there? But maybe it'd be best to hear the story of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders before we make any definitive judgment on that. Nestled into Mayes County, Oklahoma, Camp Scott used to be one of the Sooner State's premier Girl Scout camps. It's also one of the oldest, with the year 1977 being the 50th anniversary of its founding. Camp Scott also happens to be located on 410 acres of the most beautiful land in the entire country, with the surrounding area comprised of gently sloping hills, Tolkien-esque forests, and a tranquil freshwater creek. Interspersed in the area are a series of platform tent clusters which host any visitors. For those who were never scouts as kids, a platform tent is a large canvas tent pitched semi-permanently on a raised wooden platform, sometimes with a tin roof or tarp on top. It can usually sleep 4 to 6 people and has zippers on both sides of the tent to close the inner flap, with ties to close the outer and side flaps. There is no way to 100% close the tent in a secure way, but it is generally sturdier of an option than tent camping on the ground, and platform tents are somewhere between a cabin and a tent in terms of comfort. Like many Girl Scout camps, the tents at Camp Scott were arranged in small campsites scattered throughout the camp, each with fire pits and related amenities, with each named after a Native American tribe. You could be forgiven for thinking the camp was an outdoor paradise, a serene, wholesome slice of Eden, brimming with innocence, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city. But just a short while before the camp season of 1977, a training session was held in which veteran camp counselors would coach the incoming counselors in training on what would be expected of them. One of these counselors picked up a box of donuts on the way over, finding that a sweet treat made for a great conversation starter among the new arrivals and generally made them feel more welcomed. She shared a few of the donuts among her fellow counselors, but left the remaining donuts back near the counselor campground when she took the new arrivals on a tour of the area. When she returned, the donuts were gone, and in their place was a filthy handwritten note that bore just 3 scrawled words. 3 will die. The girl immediately showed the note to one of the camp's head of operations, but instead of taking the threat seriously, they dismissed the note as nothing but a tasteless prank and instructed the counselors to go about their business as usual. On the first day of camp season, Girl Scouts from all 4 corners of Oklahoma were bussed into Camp Scott to begin the first of many week-long visits. The mood was generally high among the young women, as school had recently finished and that summer break elation was still very much at its peak. But that Sunday, June 12th, was hardly an ideal summer's day. Thick fogs and misty rains had turned the camp into a complete soaked mess. Yet the Girl Scouts' spirits weren't dampened, and they remained positive as they were split into groups and shown to their respective campgrounds. Thankfully, the weather relented enough for the girls to partake in a few camp activities before sundown. But as night fell, the rain resumed with a vengeance, and what had previously been a light smattering of drizzle turned into a full-on downpour. To keep from being soaked, the Girl Scouts rushed back to their platform tents to bed down early, confident that the weather would improve so they could return to their wholesome outdoor fun. The following morning, one of the counselors collected her wash kit and headed over to the camp's shower block. This shower block just so happened to be right at the rear of the camp near a collection of platform tents known as Kiowa, and thanks to the horseshoe arrangement of the platforms, one of them was ever so slightly obscured from view by the shower block itself. So at around 6 a.m. on the 13th of June, this counselor headed down the hillside to the trail which led to the bathhouse. But as she approached, she spotted 3 apparently occupied bags just lying there on the trail, sleeping bags that had been piled up against each other in a disturbingly unnatural way. There was no way there would be Girl Scouts in there. There was no way anyone could sleep like that. No one living, anyway. Because when the young counselor unzipped the sleeping bags to peek at what was inside, the entire camp was awoken by a blood-curdling scream. Inside the sleeping bags were 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Heather Goose, and 10-year-old Doris Denise Miller. Each had their skulls bashed in by a large blunt object, with at least 2 of them showing signs of heavy strangulation. The camp was immediately evacuated while one of the camp's directors contacted the local police force. Sniffer dogs were brought in to search for clues, and a single unknown fingerprint was taken from one of the girls' flashlights, and a bloody size 9.5 footprint was found in the tent the girls were missing from. Shortly after the camp was closed off as a crime scene, police interviewed a nearby homeowner who reportedly heard something rather heavy on the small road running between the camp and his property at around 3 a.m. on the morning of the 13th. Since all the counselors had solid alibis for the determined times of death, it was deduced that this must have been the killer moving to and from the area. After a large-scale manhunt was launched to flush out the murderer, local and federal law enforcement honed in on a man named Gene Leroy Hart. Hart already had multiple convictions for indecent assault, attempted murder, burglary, and escaping federal custody. And although he lived out near Tulsa at the time of the murders, it turned out that he grew up in a house less than a mile away from Camp Scott. It also turned out that Gene Leroy Hart was of Native American heritage, Cherokee to be exact, so police began to canvass the local charity community in hopes that they could assist them in tracking Hart down. Despite being somewhat distrustful of the visiting police officers, it said that once the local Cherokee learned that Hart was wanted in connection with the murder of 3 little girls, they fell over themselves to aid in the investigation. Eventually, a Cherokee man contacted the police by telephone, informing them of a rumor that Hart was sheltering in the isolated traditional home of a well-known medicine man. And although the place proved difficult to find, police found the tip to be a good one. Hart was arrested there and then, with the medicine man insisting he had no idea Hart was accused of such a heinous crime. According to him, Hart had merely confessed to doing something terrible, although he wouldn't specify exactly what it was. At his trial for the girls' murders, the local sheriff claimed that he was 1,000% sure that Hart was the guilty party. Yet despite the man's blind certainty, there was a number of holes in the prosecution's argument that were too significant to discount. The most pertinent being that Hart didn't wear a 9.5 size shoe, meaning it couldn't have been him that stepped in the girl's blood back at Camp Scott. The prosecution argued that a man could easily wear a size too small or too large and that the defense's argument was a flimsy one. However, when all the evidence was taken into consideration, the jury simply couldn't find Hart guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. Hart had a violent past, that much is clear, but to scapegoat him purely to sate rabid public demands for justice would be hideously unfair. Of course, there was a chance he was guilty. There was plenty of circumstantial evidence, but a man should only be locked in a cage for the rest of his life if the jury are, as the sheriff so clumsily put it, 1,000% certain. To their credit, the jury found Hart not guilty of the murders, and he walked away a free man. Yet this freedom was short-lived. After later violating his parole conditions, Hart was sent back to prison to finish his original 308-year prison sentence. You heard that right. The crimes that Hart had previously been convicted of were so utterly atrocious and prolific that a judge had seen fit to sentence him to more than 300 years in a federal penitentiary. He died of a heart attack in the prison exercise yard just 2 years later. But on the advent of DNA testing, police had the means to close the book on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murderers once and for all. When test results came back, police were stunned to discover that the chances of Hart being the girl's killer was almost 1 in 8,000. The victims' families have since demanded that more modern equipment be used in the hopes of getting more accurate readings, but law enforcement have insisted that the chances of an alternate result coming back are slim to none. As for the site of the murders, Camp Scott was never reopened to the public, becoming far too associated with a horrifying unsolved tragedy in which 3 young girls needlessly lost their lives. And without anyone convicted, there was no way anyone was going to send their kids to Camp Scott while the killer still stalked the area. These days, there's little left but forest where the camp once stood. Nothing to remind anyone of the 3 little girls who only ever wanted to have a fun summer at camp, but never returned home. 19-year-old Faith Hedgepath was just as pure a spirit as one can expect to find in such a grim, dark world, and a member of the Native American Sapani tribe. Ever since she was a young girl, she had wanted to work with children to help the most vulnerable members of her society grow into happy, healthy, responsible people who could help make the world a better place. Faith knew that there were 2 career paths that she could take in order to make that a reality, being a pediatrician or a teacher. So she enrolled herself at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and was in the 3rd year of her undergraduate studies in the year 2012. During the spring of that year, Faith took a break from her academic studies and took up residence in an off-campus apartment near the borders between Orange and Durham counties. Her roommates in this particular apartment complex were a girl by the name of Karina Rosario, who Faith had been very close friends with since the middle of her freshman year, and Karina's boyfriend, Eric Takoy Jones. Karina and Eric's relationship was a tumultuous one at best, one that had a deep running history of tension, violence, and abuse. In the end, Karina had to move out in order to escape the relationship, with Eric also moving out shortly afterward. However, it seems that Eric was violent and paranoid and attempted to break into the apartment twice after Karina had changed the locks, apparently having convinced himself that the whole thing was a ploy and that Karina had moved back in. But even though this was not the case and Karina had not moved back in, she and Faith continued to spend a great deal of time together, as one might expect from two close friends who had been through so much together. Faith had even driven Karina down to the county courthouse in order to get a restraining order against Eric, who was apparently enraged by the positive influence she had in his ex's life, and had threatened to harm her because of this on more than one occasion. Months later, during September of 2012, when Faith was living back on the college's campus, she attended a sorority rush at Alpha Pi Omega, a traditionally Native American sorority. Given that she had a paper to busy herself with that night, she departed the event just after 7 p.m., heading over to David Library with Karina and making sure to text her dad to let him know her whereabouts. The pair then left the library at around 11:30 that night, heading back to their campus apartment together before walking down to a dance club in downtown Chapel Hill called The Thrill. Security footage from the dance club shows the girls leaving at around 2 in the morning, with a neighbor of the girls reporting that she heard noises coming from their apartments at around 3, leading us to believe that they did in fact make it home safe. But what happened after that is very, very unclear. Records show that someone logged into Faith's Facebook at around 3 a.m., with a text being sent from her phone to her former boyfriend around 40 minutes later. "Hey B, can you come over here please? Rosario needs you more, haha. Please let her know you care." The ex-boyfriend, a boy named Brandon, read the message just after 4 a.m. and replied questioning who sent the message. Karina's phone records show that Karina was trying to call Brandon at around the same time, and when he failed to answer, she attempted to call another boy named Jordan, who arrived at the apartment at around 4:30 in the morning to drive Karina to a friend's place where she stayed overnight. The following morning, Karina returned to the apartment with a friend, expecting to find Faith home alone but in good health. Yet when she walked through the door, the apartment was deathly quiet. She called out to Faith but received no reply, assuming her roommate had gone off to lectures or to the library. But Karina had a bad feeling in her gut. She hadn't heard from Faith all morning, and so just to be certain, she slid open her roommate's bedroom door and peered inside. What she saw next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Karina found Faith's dead body, partially naked and wrapped in a quilt. Neighbors would report hearing an ear-splitting scream around that time before 911 police dispatchers received an urgent call to attend the address in question. When the police arrived to investigate the scene, they found a large amount of blood splatter in the bedroom where Faith's body was located, along with an empty bottle of rum that also had a significant amount of blood on it, indicating that it was the murder weapon. Aside from the blunt force trauma to her head, Faith had all manners of cuts and bruises to other areas of her body, as well as dried blood under her fingernails. These were deemed to be defensive wounds from when she tried and failed to fight off her attacker. Horrifyingly, there was evidence of indecent assault, with a sizable amount of male DNA being found at the scene. After a distraught Karina was interviewed by police in the immediate aftermath of the body's discovery, her abusive ex-boyfriend Eric was considered the #1 suspect in Faith's murder. Police seized his cell phone, finding texts that he had sent to a friend that very same evening that seemed to ask for forgiveness for what he was about to do. He also tweeted out a similar sentiment to his followers, implying he was about to do something terrible. The tweet read, "Dear Lord, forgive me for all my sins and the sins I may commit today. Protect me from the girls who don't deserve me and the ones who wish me dead today. It seems the cops had bagged their man, an abuser whose social media status was tantamount to a confession. But shockingly, when Eric's DNA was compared to that which was found at the scene of the crime, it didn't match. Local police also compared the DNA to many of them who were found to be present at the dance club that Faith and Karina had attended that evening, but again, all samples came back as negative matches. A GoFundMe page was set up, crowdfunding a reward for information that peaked at $39,000, but still no usable leads or information was forthcoming. Interestingly, the 911 call made by Karina after she found the body has some under a considerable amount of scrutiny, with some suggesting that the call didn't come from Karina at all, but actually from the friend who accompanied her to the apartment that day, a girl named Marisol. Not only does the voice on the recording not sound like Karina, but the caller never once mentions Faith by name, only ever referring to the victim as my friend. Whoever made the phone call also lied to the dispatcher, telling them that she touched the body to check if Faith was still breathing, but when the body was analyzed for fingerprints, none matching Karina's or Marisol's came back, almost as if they were afraid to implicate themselves in Faith's murder. Police also recovered a handwritten note from the crime scene, one written in black ink on a piece of paper torn from a fast food takeout joint. The handwriting is scrawled and barely legible, so law enforcement aren't entirely sure if the note says, "I'm not stupid, jealous witch," or "I'm not jealous, stupid witch." The sloppy writing could be the result of two things. Either whoever wrote it was drunk, or they had used their non-dominant hand in order to throw off handwriting analysis who might have been able to use it to identify the killer. It was also left at a crime scene where the victim's blood was splattered almost everywhere, yet the note showed no traces of having blood on it, proof that it was written somewhere else before being dropped near her body. The handwritten note has been something that has confused professional and amateur sleuths time and time again, and it has even been suggested that it's a complete red herring, left by the killer to simply confuse those that wish to get to the bottom of Faith's murder. Perhaps the most important piece of evidence we have from this case is taken from a butt dial made from Faith's phone at just past 1 a.m. The recording is around 3 minutes long and details a conversation made between Faith, another girl, and another guy. Audio experts were hired to enhance the audio. They claim that it clearly records Faith crying for help. It also records a male voice saying, "I think she's dying," while a female voice is saying, "Do it anyhow." An intense discussion that seems to commence, which ends in the unknown female becoming enraged. The unknown male and the unknown female can also apparently be heard using the names Eric and Rosie, and if that is true, there is no doubt that this is Karina Rosario and her abusive ex-boyfriend, Eric. Faith's father is convinced that the recording is of his daughter's death, yet the model of phone that she had used at the time of her death is incapable of time-stamping phone calls accurately, meaning that the recording could have been made at any point during the night. 4 years later, in an effort to definitively identify a suspect, local police released a phenotype of the killer, constructed using the sample of DNA left at the scene. The profile shows that the murderer is of mixed Native American and European ancestry, specifically a mix of Mexican, Colombian, and Iberian heritage, with small amounts of other South American and African ancestry. It is very likely that he would have been considered Latino and would have olive or tan skin, black hair, and few freckles. Despite the original pool of suspects numbering in the thousands, police have managed to whittle it down to just 10 potentially guilty parties. As has been previously stated, the obvious suspect, Eric Tacoy Jones, was not a DNA match, but local law enforcement confirmed that the murderer was almost definitely someone that Faith knew, even if he wasn't someone particularly close, a mutual friend or a classmate, for example. It also remains unclear if it was the work of a lone killer or if such a person had an accomplice. Karina Rosario, on the other hand, remains one of the most interesting and intriguing figures in this case. What would possess her to text or call two people so late in the night with such urgency? Why would she leave one of her best friends in the world, one that had been so good to her throughout her rocky relationship, all alone in an apartment that had been the target of repeated break-ins by a psycho ex-boyfriend? And what was going on with that bizarre 911 call she did or perhaps didn't make? As of 2019, Chapel Hill police were still in contact with her, despite the fact that she's attempted to escape the situation by moving out of North Carolina. According to them, Karina is still cooperative and answers all their queries to the best of her abilities. Yet, in the words of local reporter Tom Gasparelli, it's true that the cops still believe that there's more Rosario can tell them, and it sounds to me like Karina has long been in their crosshairs as a key figure who knows much, much more than she says she does.